In the shadowy halls of Greystone Manor, a single stopped watch holds the key to a chilling murder. Why was Sir Reginald poisoned? Who tampered with his manuscript, tearing at the heart of a family's legacy? As secrets unravel and loyalties fracture, Miss Jane Marple sees what others miss. But can she expose the killer before the truth destroys them all? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Willoughby Hall. The late summer sun casts long, golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Willoughby Hall, a grand Georgian manor nestled in the heart of the St. Mary Mead countryside. Its ivy-clad walls and tall sash windows gleamed with an air of timeless dignity. Yet beneath its serene facade, a quiet unease stirred among the guests assembling for the weekend. The occasion was the 60th birthday of Sir Reginald Haverford, a retired barrister of considerable wealth and questionable charm, whose invitations were rarely declined, if only for the promise of his renowned hospitality and the whispers of his even more renowned secrets. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned wicker chair on the terrace, sipped her tea and observed the arriving guests with the unobtrusive keenness of a seasoned naturalist studying a flock of rare birds. Her delicate hands, clad in lace gloves, rested lightly on her lap, and her soft gray eyes, framed by a modest bonnet, missed nothing. She had not been invited for her own sake, oh no. Sir Reginald scarcely knew of her existence, but as the guest of her dear friend, Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, whose late husband had been a close acquaintance of the Haverfords. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had accepted the invitation out of curiosity, for the village gossip had been abuzz with tales of Sir Reginald's latest entanglements, both financial and personal. The terrace was alive with the hum of polite conversation, punctuated by the clink of teacups and the rustle of silk dresses. Sir Reginald himself stood at the center of the group, a tall, imposing figure with a mane of silver hair and a voice that carried the weight of the courtroom. His wife, Lady Evelyn Haverford, a woman of ethereal beauty and nervous disposition, flitted about, ensuring the guests were attended to. Her smile was gracious, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands as she poured tea, and the way her eyes darted toward her husband whenever he spoke. Among the guests was young Dr. Lionel Cresswell, a physician from London, whose boyish charm and quick wit made him a favorite among the ladies. He laughed easily, but Miss Marple observed how his gaze lingered on Lady Evelyn a moment too long. Then there was Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a widow of considerable means, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes suggested a woman not easily deceived,
spectacles slipping down her nose as she clutched a novel to her chest. And finally, there was Mr. Victor Crane, a solicitor, and Sir Reginald's trusted confidant, whose pinched features and meticulous attire spoke of a man who thrived on order and secrecy. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a subtle exchange between Gerald Winthrop and Mr. Crane. As the solicitor passed by, Gerald muttered something under his breath, and Crane's face tightened, though he continued walking without reply. Miss Marple tilted her head, filing the moment away in her mind, much as she might tuck a stray skein of wool into her knitting bag. "Jane, you're awfully quiet," Mrs. Bantry said, leaning closer with a conspiratorial smile. "What are you thinking? That Sir Reginald's port is too sweet, or that his guests are too sour?" Miss Marple chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, Dolly, you do have a way with words. I was merely observing how very interesting this gathering is. So many different souls, each with their own little stories. One wonders how they all fit together." Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow. "You and your observations. I swear, Jane, you see more in a glance than most people do in a lifetime. Now, tell me, what do you make of Lady Evelyn? She seems dreadfully on edge, don't you think?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Lady Evelyn, who was now speaking with Dr. Cresswell. The young doctor's hand brushed hers as he accepted a biscuit, and she flinched, though her smile remained fixed. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "She does seem rather like a bird in a cage, doesn't she? Beautiful, but trapped. I wonder what it is that frightens her so." The afternoon wore on, and the guests retired to their rooms to dress for dinner. Miss Marple, ever frugal, declined the offer of a maid and unpacked her own modest suitcase, arranging her knitting needles and a small notebook on the bedside table. As she did so, she reflected on the undercurrents she had sensed. Sir Reginald's booming laughter had a forced quality, as if masking some deeper discontent. Mrs. Winthrop's barbed remarks about new money and old debts had drawn sharp looks from Gerald, and Beatrice, poor child, seemed to shrink whenever her uncle addressed her directly. It was, Miss Marple thought, a house full of secrets, each guest a thread in a tapestry she could not yet fully discern. Dinner was a grand affair, served in the oak-paneled dining room beneath a glittering chandelier. Sir Reginald presided at the head of the table, his anecdotes of legal triumphs met with polite laughter. Lady Evelyn, seated at the opposite end, picked at her food, her eyes darting to the clock on the mantelpiece, which read 8:17 p.m. Miss Marple, seated beside Mrs. Bantry, noted the precise time, for she had a habit of marking such details, however trivial they might seem.
Glass in hand. "My dear friends," he began, his voice rich with practiced charm, "I am delighted to have you all here to celebrate this milestone. 60 years is no small thing, and I owe much of my success and happiness to those around this table." His eyes lingered on Lady Evelyn, who smiled faintly but did not meet his gaze. It was then that Mr. Crane cleared his throat, drawing attention. "If I may, Sir Reginald, I have a small announcement to make. As your solicitor, I've prepared a revision to your will, which you requested I finalize this weekend. Perhaps after dinner we might—" "No need to bore our guests with business, Victor," Sir Reginald interrupted, his tone jovial but firm. "Tonight is for celebration, not paperwork." The table fell silent, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of annoyance in Crane's eyes, quickly masked. The conversation resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted, like a cloud passing over the sun. Miss Marple sipped her wine, her mind turning over the solicitor's words. A revised will. Such things, she knew from long experience, were rarely without consequence. As the guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple lingered in the dining room, ostensibly to admire a portrait of Sir Reginald's late father. In truth, she was watching Gerald Winthrop, who had slipped out onto the terrace, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. She noted the time again, 9:42 p.m., and the way the moonlight caught the glint of something metallic in his pocket as he turned away. "Jane, you'll miss the coffee," Mrs. Bantry called from the doorway. "Coming, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but her mind alert. She had seen enough in her quiet village of St. Mary Mead to know that a storm was brewing at Willoughby Hall, and as always, she would watch and listen, her little grey cells already at work, piecing together the threads of a mystery that had not yet fully revealed itself. Chapter 2. The Shadow Falls. The drawing-room at Willoughby Hall glowed with the soft light of candelabras, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the polished mahogany furniture. The guests, still dressed in their evening finery, sipped coffee or brandy, their voices a low murmur of polite chatter. Yet to Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, the air felt heavy with unspoken tension, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the conversation, as her sharp eyes darted from one guest to another, noting the subtle gestures that betrayed their unease. Sir Reginald Haverford stood by the grand piano, regaling Dr. Lionel Cresswell with a tale of a particularly contentious handkerchief in her lap, her eyes fixed on the carpet as if it held some hidden answer.
Mrs. Clara Winthrop, her lips pursed, muttered something to her son Gerald, who slouched in a chair, his tie loosened and his expression sullen. Miss Beatrice Langley, Sir Reginald's niece, sat apart, her nose buried in her novel, though her fingers trembled as she turned the pages. Mr. Victor Crane, the solicitor, stood near the window, his back to the room, gazing out into the darkened garden as if seeking escape. Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, ever sociable, leaned toward Miss Marple. "Really, Jane, you must stop knitting and join the conversation. You're missing all the fun. Did you hear Sir Reginald's story about the judge who mistook his wig for a cat?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, Dolly, I find I learn far more by listening than by speaking. People reveal so much when they think no one is watching." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "You and your watching, I swear. You'd spot a secret in a saint. What do you make of this lot, then? They're all dreadfully polite, but I'd wager there's a quarrel brewing somewhere." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing for a moment. "There is a certain discord in the air, is there not? Like a melody played just slightly out of tune." Her words were interrupted by a sudden, piercing scream from the direction of the library. The room fell silent, glasses frozen midway to lips, eyes wide with alarm. Sir Reginald set down his brandy with a clatter and strode toward the door, followed closely by Dr. Cresswell and Mr. Crane. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm, whispering, "Good heavens, what was that?" Miss Marple, calm as ever, tucked her knitting into her bag and rose. "We shall soon find out, Dolly, let us go and see." The guests hurried down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs, and gathered at the library door. The heavy oak panel stood ajar, and inside, a scene of chaos awaited. Lady Evelyn stood in the centre of the room, her face ashen, her hands pressed to her mouth. At her feet lay Sir Reginald's prized antique dagger, its silver blade gleaming in the lamplight, and slumped in a high-backed chair by the fireplace, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, was Sir Reginald himself, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "He's dead," he said after a moment, his voice steady but strained. "Stabbed, it appears. The wound is fresh, within the last few minutes." A gasp rippled through the group. Mrs. Winthrop clutched her son's arm, her face pale. "Murdered? Here? In his own home?" Her voice carried a note of indignation, as if the crime were a personal affront. Gerald Winthrop pulled away from his mother, his eyes darting to the dagger on the floor. "Who could have done this? We were all in the drawing room." "Not all of us," Mr. Crane said quietly, his gaze sweeping the room. "Lady Evelyn, you were not with us when the scream was heard. Where were you?" Lady Evelyn's eyes widened and she swayed slightly, catching herself on the edge of a table. I came to the library to fetch a book. I found him like this and screamed. I swear I didn't." "Enough!" Dr. Cresswell interrupted, rising to his feet. "We must telephone the police at once, and no one is to touch anything in this room." Miss Marple, standing near the doorway, observed the scene with quiet intensity. Her eyes lingered on the dagger, its ornate handle engraved with the Haverford crest. She noted the position of Sir Reginald's body, the way his right hand hung limply over the armrest, and the faint smudge of lipstick on his cuff. A shade, she thought, that matched Lady Evelyn's. She also noticed a small brass key, half hidden beneath a fold of the rug, glinting faintly in the firelight. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Jane, this is dreadful. Poor Sir Reginald, and in his own library. Who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "That, Dolly, is precisely what we must discover. But I suspect the answer lies not only in what we see, but in what we do not yet understand." The butler, a stooped man named Jenkins, appeared at the door, his face pale. "I telephoned the police, sir," he said to Dr. Cresswell. "They'll be here within the hour. They've instructed that no one is to leave the house." "Very well," Dr. Cresswell said, taking charge with the authority of his profession. "Everyone back to the drawing room. We must wait for the police." As the guests shuffled out, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. She bent slightly, as if adjusting her shawl, and took a closer look at the brass key. It was small, the kind that might fit a desk drawer or a private safe. She made a mental note of its position before straightening and following the others. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Gerald Winthrop lit another cigarette, his hands still trembling. Mrs. Winthrop sat rigidly, her eyes narrowing as she watched Lady Evelyn, who had collapsed onto the settee, sobbing softly. Beatrice Langley clutched her novel tighter, her knuckles white, while Mr. Crane paced near the window, his face unreadable. Dr. Cresswell stood by the fireplace, his jaw set, as if bracing for the storm to come. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking once more. "Dolly," she said softly, "do you recall what time it was when we left the dining room?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Why, it was just after 9:30, I think. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason in particular," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. But her mind was racing, piecing together.
She'd seen Gerald on the terrace. The scream had come at approximately 10:03 by her small pocket watch. A mere 21 minutes, yet, in that time, Sir Reginald had been murdered. The question was not only who, but how, and why. As the guests sat in uneasy silence, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the dagger, the key, and the smudge of lipstick. She recalled the tension at dinner, the mention of a revised will, and the fleeting glances that had passed between the guests. In her experience, murder was rarely a sudden act. It was the culmination of secrets long buried, of desires thwarted, of trusts betrayed. And at Willoughby Hall, she sensed, those secrets were only beginning to unravel. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Miss Marple's Insight. The library at Willoughby Hall, now a scene of grim significance, was cordoned off by the heavy oak door, behind which Sir Reginald Haverford's body still lay, awaiting the coroner's arrival. The guests had retreated to the drawing room, their voices hushed, their faces pale with shock or suspicion. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily towards 11 p.m., its rhythmic chime a stark reminder of the fleeting time between Sir Reginald's last breath and the chaos that had ensued. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fireplace with her knitting in her lap, appeared to all as a frail, elderly spinster, her delicate frame dwarfed by the high-backed chair. Yet her mind was as sharp as the needles she wielded, and her soft grey eyes darted from one guest to another, cataloguing their every gesture. Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, perched beside her, was less composed. "Jane, this is simply dreadful," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Murder, right here under our noses, and poor Lady Evelyn, she looks ready to faint. Do you think she really found him like that? Or—" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she tilted her head, her expression serene, but her gaze penetrating. "My dear Dolly, it is far too early to say, but I have found that the truth often hides in the smallest details, the things people overlook because they seem unimportant. We must be patient and observe." The drawing-room door opened, and Jenkins, the butler, announced the arrival of Inspector Hargreaves, a stout, middle-aged man with a no-nonsense air and a notebook already in hand. Behind him trailed a young constable, who looked faintly overwhelmed by the grandeur of Willoughby Hall. The inspector surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the assembled guests. Lady Evelyn, her face streaked with tears, Dr. Lionel Cresswell, standing protectively near her, Mrs. Clara Winthrop, her lips pursed in disapproval, Gerald Winthrop, slouched in a chair, his cigarette smouldering, Miss Beatrice Langley, clutching her novel like a shield, and Mr. Victor Crane, whose precise movements suggested a man accustomed to control, even in crisis. Measured. "I understand this is a distressing time, but we must establish the facts. Sir Reginald Haverford has been murdered, and I'll need to speak with each of you. No one is to leave the house until we've completed our inquiries." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Mrs. Winthrop sniffed loudly. "This is outrageous! Are we to be treated as criminals in our host's home?" "Not criminals, madam.
The inspector replied evenly. Witnesses. For now. If you'll all remain here, I'll begin with Lady Evelyn in the study. Lady Evelyn rose, her movements unsteady, and Dr. Cresswell offered his arm, which she accepted with a fleeting glance of gratitude. As they left, Miss Marple noted the way Gerald Winthrop's eyes followed them, his jaw tightening. She also observed Mr. Crane, who had returned to his post by the window, his fingers drumming lightly on the sill, a small, nervous habit that belied his composed exterior. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "Jane, you don't suppose Lady Evelyn could have… well, you know? She was alone in the library when she screamed." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Dolly, you are always so quick to suspect. But let us consider. Lady Evelyn is a delicate creature, easily shaken. If she were guilty, would she draw attention to herself with a scream? Or is that precisely what a clever mind might do? No, we must not jump to conclusions. We must wait for the facts to arrange themselves." The inspector's interviews began, and one by one the guests were summoned to the study. Miss Marple, content to remain in the background, listened as the others whispered among themselves. Gerald Winthrop muttered about bad business and lit another cigarette, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. Mrs. Winthrop scolded him for his slovenly posture, her voice sharp, but her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Beatrice Langley, silent as ever, seemed to shrink further into her chair, her novel unopened now, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. When it was Miss Marple's turn, she entered the study with her usual unassuming grace, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Inspector Hargreaves looked up from his notebook, his expression one of polite impatience. "Miss Marple, is it? I understand you're a guest of Mrs. Bantry. I won't keep you long. Can you tell me where you were between 9:30 and 10 o'clock this evening?" Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite him, her hands folded neatly. "Of course, Inspector. I was in the dining room until approximately 9:42, though her expression remained demure. "Oh, Inspector, people are always behaving oddly, are they not? But I did observe that Sir Reginald seemed preoccupied at dinner. His laughter was rather forced, I thought, and Mr. Crane's mention of a revised will caused a certain tension. As for the others, well, one sees little things, a glance, a gesture, that might mean nothing or everything." Hargreaves frowned, clearly unsure what to make of this elderly lady, with her vague yet pointed observations. "Right. Anything more specific? Did you see anyone leave the drawing room before the scream?" "I did not," Miss Marple replied. "But I did notice young Mr. Winthrop step onto the terrace earlier, at 9:42. He was lighting a cigarette, and I saw something metallic in his pocket, perhaps a cigarette case. Or perhaps not. One cannot be sure." The inspector jotted this down, his interest piqued. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That'll be all for now." As she rose, Miss Marple paused, her gaze falling on a small desk in the corner of the study. Its lock was identical to the brass key she had seen in the library, half hidden beneath the rug. She said nothing, but filed the observation away, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing interview. Dr. Cresswell returned, his face grim, and whispered something to Lady Evelyn, who nodded faintly. Gerald Winthrop, when called, slouched out with a scowl, muttering about damned impertinence. Mrs. Winthrop watched him go, her lips a thin line. Beatrice Langley, summoned last, seemed almost reluctant to leave her chair, her eyes wide with fear. When all had been questioned, Inspector Hargreaves addressed the group. "We've established a preliminary timeline. Sir Reginald was last seen alive at 9:30 p.m. when the party moved to the drawing room. The scream was heard at 10:03, and Lady Evelyn claims she found him dead moments before.
That gives us a window of approximately 30 minutes. I'll need alibis for each of you during that time, and we'll be searching the house for further evidence." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her face serene. But her mind was far from idle. The dagger, the key, the lipstick smudge on Sir Reginald's cuff. These were not random details, but pieces of a puzzle. She thought of the tension at dinner, the mention of the will, and the way Gerald's hand had trembled as he lit his cigarette. She thought, too, of Lady Evelyn's nervous glances and Dr. Cresswell's protective demeanour. In her experience, murder was never a simple act. It was a tapestry woven from greed, fear, or love gone astray. And at Willoughby Hall, she sensed, the threads were beginning to form a pattern, one she would unravel, step by careful step.
Of suspicion. The guests sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between one another as the clock on the mantelpiece ticked past midnight. The air was thick with the scent of coffee gone cold, and the faint tang of cigarette smoke from Gerald Winthrop's incessant habit. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting needles moving rhythmically, appeared as serene as ever. But her sharp grey eyes missed nothing. Way Lady Evelyn's fingers twisted her handkerchief, the restless pacing of Mr. Victor Crane, the sullen slump of Gerald's shoulders. To her, the room was a stage, and each guest an actor playing a part, whether they knew it or not. Inspector Hargreaves stood at the centre, his notebook open, his expression one of dogged determination. The young constable, Constable Price, hovered at his side, scribbling furiously as the inspector began his interrogations in earnest. Miss Marple, content to observe from the sidelines, noted the inspector's methodical approach, but she also sensed his reliance on the obvious: alibis, timelines, physical evidence. In her experience, the truth often lay in the subtle occurrence of human behavior, the unspoken motives that simmered beneath the surface. "Lady Evelyn," Hargreaves began, his tone firm but not unkind, "let's go over your account again. You say you went to the library to fetch a book and found Sir Reginald already dead. What time was this precisely?" Lady Evelyn, pale and trembling, lifted her eyes from her handkerchief. "It was just after 10 o'clock, Inspector. I don't know the exact minute. I went to the library to find a novel I'd promised Beatrice I'd lend her. When I entered, I saw him, slumped in the chair, with that dreadful dagger on the floor. I screamed, and then everyone came." Hargreaves nodded, jotting a note. "And you saw no one else in the library? No one leaving as you approached?" "No one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Lionel Cresswell, standing nearby, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and Miss Marple noted the fleeting glance of gratitude she gave him, as well as the faint flush that rose to her cheeks. Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, seated beside Miss Marple, leaned close. "Jane, she's hiding something, don't you think? She's so nervous, it's as if she expects to be accused at any moment." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Nervousness, Dolly, can mean many things: guilt, fear, or simply the shock of discovery. We must be careful not to assume too much. But I do find it curious that she went to fetch a book at such an hour, don't you? And for Beatrice, who has scarcely left her own novel all evening." The inspector moved on to "Single stab to the chest, Inspector, likely piercing the heart. Death would have been instantaneous, or nearly so. As for my whereabouts, I was in the drawing room with the others after dinner, except for a brief moment when I stepped into the hall to fetch my medical bag from my room. I'd promised Lady Evelyn a mild sedative. She'd mentioned feeling unwell earlier." "What time was that?" Hargreaves pressed. "Around 9:50, I believe," Cresswell replied smoothly. "I was back in the drawing room by 9:55. Jenkins can confirm. He saw me in the hall." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. 5 minutes, she thought, was enough time to slip into the library if one were quick. And Dr. Cresswell's protective demeanour toward Lady Evelyn was not lost on her. She recalled the smudge of lipstick on Sir Reginald's cuff,
a shade that matched Lady Evelyn's. Could it have been transferred during a struggle, or something more intimate? Next, the inspector turned to Mrs. Clara Winthrop, who sat ramrod straight, her expression one of barely concealed indignation. "Mrs. Winthrop, your whereabouts, please." "I was in the drawing-room the entire time," she said sharply. "I have no interest in wandering about at night like some people. My son, Gerald, was with me, though he insists on smoking those wretched cigarettes outside every chance he gets." Gerald slouched in his chair, rolled his eyes. "I told you, Mother, I was on the terrace for a few minutes. Around 9:40, I'd say. I came back in well before the scream. Ask Miss Marple. She saw me." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice gentle. "Indeed, Inspector, I did see Mr. Winthrop on the terrace at 9:42, lighting a cigarette. He returned shortly after." She did not mention the metallic glint in his pocket, but she filed it away, wondering if it could have been the dagger, or something else entirely. Hargreaves turned to Mr. Victor Crane, who had ceased his pacing and now stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of composure. "Mr. Crane, you're Sir Reginald's solicitor. You mentioned a revised will at dinner. Care to elaborate? And where were you during the critical half-hour?" Crane's lips twitched, as if suppressing a frown. "The will is a private matter, Inspector, but I can assure you it was a routine update, nothing more. As for my whereabouts, I was in the drawing-room, though I stepped out briefly to the cloakroom at around 9:45 to retrieve my pocketbook. I was gone no more than 3 minutes." Miss Marple noted the precision of his answer, as well as the faint tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his cufflinks. A man of order, she thought, yet unsettled by something. The mention of the will had caused a stir at dinner, and she wondered what changes Sir Reginald had intended and who stood to lose by them. Finally, the inspector addressed Miss Beatrice Langley, who shrank under his gaze, her spectacles slipping nose.
Miss Langley, you were reading in the drawing-room, I understand. Did you leave at any point? Beatrice shook her head vigorously.
"No, Inspector, I stayed right here. I don't like wandering about in strange houses. I was reading The Hound of the Baskervilles until the scream startled me."
Hargreaves scribbled a final note and closed his notebook. "Very well. We'll verify these alibis and search the house tomorrow. For now, I suggest you all retire to your rooms and stay there until morning. Constable Price will remain on duty." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting bag in hand. She approached the inspector, her demeanour humble.
"Inspector Hargreaves, might I have a word? It's a small thing, but I noticed a brass key in the library near the rug. It seemed out of place. Perhaps it belongs to the desk in the study?"
Hargreaves blinked, surprised by her observation. "A key, you say? We'll look into it, Miss Marple." "Thank you." Mrs. Bantry, waiting by the door, whispered,
"Jane, you're incorrigible. A key?
What does it mean?"
Miss Marple smiled faintly.
"Perhaps nothing, Dolly. Or perhaps it unlocks more than a desk. In my experience, people lock away what they most wish to hide. Secrets, fears, or even guilt."
As they climbed the grand staircase to their rooms, Miss Marple's mind was alight with questions. The dagger, the key, the lipstick, the will, each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. She thought of Dr. Cresswell's quick trip to his room, Gerald's mysterious glint, Crane's nervous precision, and Beatrice's trembling hands. And Lady Evelyn, poor, fragile Lady Evelyn, whose scream had summoned them all, yet whose story seemed incomplete. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen how small details could unravel great crimes. And at Willoughby Hall, she sensed, the truth was waiting to be knit together, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning after Sir Reginald Haverford's murder dawned grey and heavy, with a fine mist cloaking the grounds of Willoughby Hall. The grandeur of the manor seemed muted, its ivy-clad walls dulled by the weight of tragedy. Inside, the guests gathered in the dining room for a subdued breakfast, their appetites diminished by the events of the previous night.
The clink of silverware against porcelain was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional murmur of strained conversation. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table with her cup of tea and a modest slice of toast, observed the group with her usual quiet vigilance. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a silent companion to her thoughts, which were interviews would take place throughout the day. The guests, confined to the house, moved with the restless unease of caged animals, their eyes darting suspiciously at one another. Miss Marple noted the way Lady Evelyn avoided looking at Dr. Lionel Cresswell, who sat opposite her, his usual charm subdued. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, ever imperious, buttered her toast with sharp, precise movements, while her son Gerald slouched in his chair, his face pale and his eyes red-rimmed, as if he had slept poorly, if at all. Miss Beatrice Langley, her novel abandoned, fidgeted with her napkin, her spectacles slipping down her nose. Mr. Victor Crane, the solicitor, maintained his air of meticulous calm, though Miss Marple observed a faint crease in his brow that had not been there the previous evening. Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, seated beside Miss Marple, leaned close. "Jane, this is all so grim," she whispered. "Everyone looks guilty, don't they? I mean, Gerald's positively haggard, and Lady Evelyn hasn't touched her food. Do you think the inspector's got his eye on someone?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Dolly, you are quite right that appearances can be telling, but they can also deceive. The inspector, I suspect, is focusing on the obvious, as inspectors often do. But the truth, I find, is rarely so straightforward." Her words were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Hargreaves, who entered the dining room with a purposeful stride. "Good morning," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We've made some progress in our investigation, and I have a few points to clarify. First, the murder weapon. The dagger has been identified as part of Sir Reginald's collection, kept in a display case in the library. The case was unlocked, and the key was found nearby, as Miss Marple pointed out." He nodded briefly in her direction, and Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression demure. Hargreaves continued. "More interestingly, we found fingerprints on the dagger, clear prints belonging to Mr. Gerald Winthrop." A gasp rippled through the room. Gerald's head snapped up, his cigarette dropping to the table. "What? That's impossible," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "I never touched that dagger. I was on the terrace, like I said." Mrs. Winthrop's face flushed with indignation. "This is outrageous, Inspector. My son is no murderer. He's a reckless boy, yes, but to accuse him of this—" "Calm yourself, Mrs. Winthrop," Hargreaves said, raising a hand. "Fingerprints are evidence, not proof. But Mr. Winthrop, you'll need to explain how your prints ended up on a weapon you claim not to have touched." Gerald's eyes darted wildly, his hands trembling as he lit another cigarette. I don't know. I've been in the library before. Sure, maybe I touched it some other time, looking at Sir Reginald's collection. He was always showing off those—" Marple's needles clicked softly, her face serene, but her mind alert. Gerald's explanation was plausible, she thought, but his panic suggested more than mere surprise. She recalled the metallic glint in his pocket on the terrace at 9:42 p.m. Could it have been the dagger? Yet the timeline troubled her. If Gerald had been on the terrace, seen by her own eyes, how could he have entered the library, stabbed Sir Reginald, and returned unnoticed in the brief window before the scream at 10:03? Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Jane, do you think Gerald did it? Those fingerprints, why, it's practically a confession." "Not quite, Dolly," Miss Marple murmured. "Fingerprints are like gossip, suggestive but not always truthful. In my village, I once knew a young man whose fingerprints were found on a stolen silver teapot, but it turned out he'd only polished it for the vicar's wife. We must look beyond the obvious." The inspector turned his attention to the group as a whole. "I'll need each of you to provide a detailed account of your movements last night, down to the minute if possible. And Mr. Crane, I'd like to see the details of that revised will you mentioned. It may shed light on a motive." Crane's face tightened, but he nodded. "Of course, Inspector. The will is in my briefcase, locked in my room. I'll fetch it at once." The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Greystone Manor's drawing room, casting long, slanting shadows across the polished mahogany floor. The air was thick with the scent of old books and the faint, lingering trace of lavender from Lady Beatrice's perfume. Though she had not been in the room since the previous evening, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the investigation into Sir Reginald's murder was reaching a critical juncture. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed armchair near the fireplace, knitted quietly, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm that contrasted with the nervous energy of the gathered household. Captain Hastings stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed as he watched the police constables combing the garden for any overlooked evidence. Inspector Japp, ever the pragmatist, had taken to pacing the room, his notebook open, scribbling furiously as he muttered about timelines and alibis. But it was Miss Marple who commanded the true attention of the room, though she appeared entirely absorbed in her knitting. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing, not the flicker of unease in Mrs. Clara Whitmore's posture, nor the way young Edmund's fingers drummed incessantly on the arm of his chair. "Mon ami," Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "You have been most diligent in your inquiries, Inspector Japp, but I wonder if we might revisit the matter of the pocket watch."
Pocket watch, Sir Reginald's. We've been over it, Poirot. Found in his study, stopped at 10:17 p.m. Matches the doctor's estimate of the time of death. Précisément, Miss Marple said, her needles pausing for a moment as she looked up, her eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity that Hastings had come to recognize as a sign of her mind at work. But it is not the time that intrigues me, Inspector. It is the watch itself. A fine piece, gold, engraved with Sir Reginald's initials. A man of his fastidious nature would not carry a watch that was broken, no? And yet it was stopped. Deliberately, perhaps. Hastings turned from the window, his curiosity piqued. Deliberately? You mean someone tampered with it? Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, a gesture that seemed to encompass both agreement and a gentle reproof for stating the obvious. It is possible, my dear Hastings. A watch does not stop of its own accord unless it is wound down or interfered with, and Sir Reginald, as we have been told by his valet, was most particular about winding his watch each evening at precisely 9 o'clock. Japp frowned, flipping back through his notes. The valet, Mr. Grayson, did say that. But the watch could have been damaged in the struggle. The doctor said Sir Reginald was struck from behind before the poison took effect. Oui, but the blow was to the head, Miss Marple countered, her voice calm but insistent. The watch was found in his waistcoat pocket, undamaged save for its stillness. And there is another detail, Inspector, which I find most curious. The watch was found on the desk, not on Sir Reginald's person. Why would a man remove his watch and place it there, in the midst of a struggle? The room fell silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, seated on the sofa, shifted uncomfortably, her hands smoothing the folds of her black morning dress. Edmund, Sir Reginald's nephew, ceased his drumming and stared at Miss Marple, his lips parting as if to speak, but he thought better of it. Lady Beatrice, standing near the mantelpiece, toyed with a strand of her pearls, her face a mask of composed grief, though her eyes darted toward her son. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on each of them, as if weighing their reactions. It is a small thing, perhaps, she continued, resuming her knitting. But the small things, they are the threads that unravel the tapestry of a crime. Let us consider the watch further. Who had access to the study between 9 o'clock, when Sir Reginald wound his watch, and 10:17, when it stopped? Japp consulted his notes. According to the household, Sir Reginald was alone in the study after dinner, working on his manuscript. No one admits to, and perhaps, only perhaps, stopped his watch to mark the moment of their triumph. Hastings felt a chill, despite the warmth of the room. But why stop the watch? To confuse the time of death, perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps to send a message. A killer who stops a watch is a killer who wishes to be noticed, to leave a signature, however subtle. It is an act of pride, and pride, mes amis, is a most dangerous flaw. The tension of the room was palpable now. Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, only to set it down untouched. Edmund's jaw tightened, and Lady Beatrice's fingers stilled on her pearls. Even Dr. Hargrove, who had been quietly observing from a corner, seemed to stiffen at Miss Marple's words. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, turning to Jap, "might I suggest a small experiment? Let us examine the watch once more. Not for its time, but for its mechanism. A jeweler's loop, perhaps, could reveal if it was stopped by force or by design." Jap nodded, though his expression betrayed a hint of skepticism. "I'll have it sent to the station for examination. But Poirot, you're not suggesting the killer tampered with the watch just to throw us off?" "Not to throw us off, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "To draw us in. The killer wishes us to notice the watch, to ponder its significance, and in doing so, they have revealed something of themselves, a mind that is precise, methodical, perhaps even theatrical." Hastings exchanged a glance with Jap, who seemed torn between admiration and exasperation. "Right," Jap said, snapping his notebook shut. "I'll get on it. But Poirot, you're sure about this? It's just a watch." Miss Marple smiled, a small, enigmatic smile that seemed to hold a world of secrets. "Nothing, Inspector, is ever just anything. The watch is a clue, and a clue, when understood, is a window into the soul of the crime." As Jap left to make arrangements, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles moving with the same relentless precision as her mind. Hastings watched her, marveling at how she could sit so calmly, so unassumingly, while her thoughts wove a net around the killer. He glanced at the suspects, each of whom seemed to retreat into their own thoughts, their faces betraying flickers of fear, guilt, or defiance. The pocket watch, Hastings realized, was no mere trinket. It was a pivot, a point around which the entire mystery might turn. And Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for the truth, had seen it from the moment she entered Greystone Manor. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced. Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic rhythm, a metronome to her thoughts. Captain Hastings stood near the door, his arms crossed, watching the assembled household with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Inspector Jap had returned from the police station, his expression a blend of determination and frustration, clutching a report from the jeweler who had examined Sir Reginald's pocket watch. "The watch, Poirot," Jap began, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You were right about one thing. It wasn't broken. The jeweler says it was stopped deliberately. Someone turned the crown until the mechanism jammed. No damage, just intentional." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes sharp and bright. "Précise more, Inspector. A deliberate act, as I suspected. This tells us much about our killer. They are not impulsive, no? They plan, they calculate, they leave nothing to chance. But in their precision, they have left us a thread to pull." Hastings frowned, stepping closer. "But why stop the watch at all? If they wanted to confuse the time of death, why not smash it or set it to a different time?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, one that suggested she'd already considered this question. "Because, mon cher Hastings, the killer wishes to control the narrative. The watch at 10:17 is not a mistake, it is a statement. Perhaps it marks the moment of death, or perhaps it points to something else entirely, a time, a place, a person. We must consider all possibilities." The room's occupants shifted uncomfortably.
Mrs. Clara Whitmore, Sir Reginald's sister-in-law, sat rigidly on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes darted towards her nephew Edmund, who leaned against the mantelpiece, his face pale and his fingers fidgeting with a cigarette he had yet to light. Lady Beatrice, Sir Reginald's widow, stood by the window, her back to the room, her posture as composed as ever, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she adjusted her shawl. Dr. Hargrove, the family physician, sat in a corner, his medical bag at his feet, his expression unreadable but attentive. Even Mr. Grayson, the butler, who had been summoned to join the discussion, stood near the door, his usual deference tinged with a quiet wariness. Miss Marple's gaze moved from one to another, as if reading the secrets written in their silences. "Let us turn our attention," she said, "to the events of the evening. We know Sir Reginald was in his study after dinner, working on his manuscript. We know he was alone, or so we are told. But there is another detail, mes amis, that has come to my notice. The manuscript itself." Japp raised an eyebrow. "The manuscript?"
Marple said, her voice soft but commanding. "It is the state of the manuscript. When Mr. Grayson found Sir Reginald's body, the manuscript was scattered across the desk, some pages crumpled, others torn. A man as orderly as Sir Reginald would not leave his work in such disarray, no? Unless, of course, someone else disturbed it." Edmund's cigarette slipped from his fingers, landing silently on the carpet. He bent to retrieve it, his movements jerky. "The wind, perhaps," he said, his voice tight. "The window was open, wasn't it?" Miss Marple tilted her head, regarding him with a look that was both gentle and piercing. "The window, Monsieur Edmund, was indeed open, but the night was still, with no breeze to speak of, and the papers were not merely blown about, they were disordered in a way that suggests a struggle, or perhaps a search." Mrs. Whitmore's hands tightened in her lap, and she spoke, her voice sharp. "A search for what? Reginald's manuscript was hardly a treasure map. It was just his obsession with the family lineage. He was always going on about it, births, deaths, inheritances." "Exactement," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing. "And in that obsession we may find a motive. Tell me, Madam Whitmore, did Sir Reginald ever speak of a particular discovery in his research, something perhaps that might have caused unease?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Lady Beatrice turned from the window, her face pale but composed. "Reginald was always secretive about his work," she said, her voice measured. "He said it was for the family's legacy, but he never shared the details, even with me." Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed a suspicion, "And yet someone was interested enough to disturb those papers, someone who perhaps feared what Sir Reginald had uncovered. A secret, mes amis, is a powerful thing. It can drive a person to desperation, to violence." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group like a fog. Dr. Hargrove cleared his throat, his voice calm but strained. "With all due respect, Monsieur Poirot, you're suggesting someone killed Reginald over a family secret. That seems far-fetched. The poison, the blow to the head, it points to something more personal, more immediate." Miss Marple's eyes met his, and for a moment Hastings thought he saw a flicker of challenge in her gaze. "Personal, oui, Doctor. But secrets are always personal, are they not? And in a family such as this, with wealth, status, and history at stake, a secret can be a spark that ignites a fire." Inspector Japp, who had been listening intently, scribbled something in his notebook. "Right, Poirot. So you think the killer was after something in the manuscript. We'll need to go through it again, page by page. But what about the poison? We've confirmed it was cyanide, fast-acting, administered in...
Only someone close to him could have done it.
"Precisement,"
Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm.
"And that, Inspector, brings us to another lie. The brandy decanter was in the study, yes, but the glass was not. It was found in the library across the hall. Why would Sir Reginald take his brandy to the library only to return to his study to die?" Hastings felt a jolt of realization. "You're saying someone moved the glass to make it look like he drank the poison elsewhere?" Miss Marple nodded. "It is possible, Hastings. The glass, the watch, the manuscript, these are not random details. They are pieces of a puzzle, and the picture they form is one of deception. Someone in this house is hiding a truth, and that truth, I believe, is tied to the manuscript." Edmund lit his cigarette at last, his hands trembling slightly. "This is absurd," he muttered. "You're spinning theories out of nothing. My uncle was killed by a thief, or someone with a grudge, not because of some dusty old papers." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost pitying. "Monsieur Edmund, the truth is never absurd, though it may be painful, and the truth, I assure you, is closer than you think." As the group dispersed, each retreating to their own corners of the manor, Hastings watched Miss Marple, her calm exterior belying the relentless workings of her mind. The lies were surfacing, as she had predicted, and with each one, the net around the killer tightened. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The heavy oak doors of Greystone Manor seemed to groan under the weight of the secrets they guarded, as the late afternoon light cast long, wavering shadows across the polished floors. The air in the library, where the household had reconvened at Miss Jane Marple's request, was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. Bookshelves lined with leather-bound tomes loomed over the group, their silent presence a stark contrast to the undercurrent of unease that rippled through the room. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, her knitting needles idle for once, resting in her lap as she surveyed the assembled suspects with a calm, almost maternal air. Yet her eyes, sharp and unyielding, betrayed the relentless workings of her mind. Captain Hastings stood by the tall windows, his gaze flickering between the group and the gardens beyond, where the police constables continued their meticulous search. Inspector Japp, ever the professional, stood with his notebook at the ready, his jaw set as he awaited Miss Marple's next move. The suspects, Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, Edmund, Dr. Hargrove, and Mr. Grayson, the butler, sat or stood in various states of discomfort, their faces a tapestry of guarded expressions, each...
You are, did you? You might have pushed. Sneak. Well, yes, which? Tell you, I absolutely zerk. When channels be thankful, was that a murder? But I hear looking chat, but sure, even during no capital, but rats may, worms and no sir, stood out open man, but in help out who get it, folks, get them up. Here's an to another. And I'm red, will come on, y'all. Each of them get your ass. And here's make sure double look at how it's pulse. Just as you forget up your period. Make time and candle them to hold and surgery. If I'm with you, burn over. Y'all feel with the pillar and frother running battle in a burn makes us so way as well. Sorry, time. Yes, isn't be flipped as they look as in doubt. What's in the please? You think they should web starter? You want to wait. I read the bone extra. Like she got okay, touchable recognize it's Gerald Neruser. All SD beer he'll them some names as the first touch about no cut names to her mind. The answer that we're dishes from there. Hunter there who through side the things I didn't him. Got a mention of the by main means ginge any jinx gray. If it they whipping. Harry, your own stream things to me late especially in Pelham. You're right.
Marple's eyes softened, but her words were precise, cutting through the air like a blade.
Nothing, madame? A shawl left in a room where a murder took place on the very night of the crime? No. I think it means a great deal. I think you were in the library with Sir Reginald, and I think you spoke of something that caused you great distress. The silence that followed was shattered by a sudden sob. Mrs. Whitmore's hands flew to her face and she crumpled forward, her shoulders shaking. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I only wanted to protect him. Protect us all." Hastings felt a jolt of surprise, his eyes darting to Japp, who'd stepped forward, his notebook open. "Protect who, Mrs. Whitmore?" Japp asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "What did you talk about with Sir Reginald?" Mrs. Whitmore's sobs grew louder, and she shook her head, as if trying to dispel the weight of her confession. "It was about the manuscript," she said at last, her voice trembling. "Reginald, he found something. A secret about our family, about Edmund's father. He said it would ruin us, ruin Edmund's future. I begged him to destroy it, to keep it hidden, but he wouldn't listen. He said the truth had to come out."
Edmund's cigarette fell to the floor, forgotten, as he stared at his aunt, his face a mask of shock.
"What secret?"
he demanded, his voice hoarse.
"What did he find?"
Mrs. Whitmore shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks.
I can't say. It's too terrible. But I didn't kill him, I swear it. I left him in the library alive. I only wanted to protect you, Edmund."
Miss Marple watched her closely, her expression unreadable. "Madame," she said, "you have taken a step toward the truth, and for that I commend you. But there is more you are not telling us, no? The brandy glass, the shawl, the manuscript. These are threads, but they do not yet form the whole tapestry. Who else knew of this secret?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes darted towards Lady Beatrice, who had remained silent, her face pale but composed. For a moment it seemed she might speak, but she turned away, her gaze fixed on the darkening gardens outside. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the storm of emotions in the room. "The heart," she said softly, almost to herself, "is a fragile thing, mes amis. It can love, it can fear, it can betray, and sometimes it can kill." As the group dispersed, Mrs. Whitmore's confession hanging heavy in the air, Hastings felt a chill run through him. The net was tightening, but the killer remained elusive, their motives obscured by layers of lies and half-truths. Miss Marple, however, seemed undeterred, thick with the scent of impending rain and the unspoken fears of its inhabitants. The grand dining room, where Miss Jane Marple had requested the household to gather, was lit by the soft glow of candelabras, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the paneled walls. The long mahogany table, usually a place of formal dinners and polite conversation, now served as the stage for a different kind of gathering, one orchestrated by the unassuming yet relentless Miss Marple. She sat at one end of the table, her knitting neatly folded in her lap, her posture as composed as ever, though her eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity that suggested she was about to spring a trap. Captain Hastings stood near the doorway, his arms crossed, his gaze shifting between the suspects seated around the table. Inspector Japp, ever the diligent officer, stood by Miss Marple's side, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of cautious anticipation. The suspects, Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, Edmund, Dr. Hargrove, and Mr. Grayson, sat in uneasy silence, their faces a study in tension. The weight of Mrs. Whitmore's earlier confession still hung in the air, but Miss Marple's demeanor suggested that she was far from finished unraveling the mystery of Sir Reginald's murder. "Mes amis," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but carrying the authority of one who has seen through the veil of deception, "we have come to a moment of truth. The threads of this crime, the watch, the manuscript, the brandy glass, the shawl, have begun to weave a pattern, but it is a pattern that requires one final touch to reveal its full design. Tonight, I propose to apply a little pressure to see who among us will falter." Lady Beatrice, seated at the opposite end of the table, raised her chin, her eyes narrowing. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice cool but with a faint tremor, "this sounds like a game. My husband is dead and you speak of patterns and pressure. What do you hope to achieve?" Miss Marble's lips curved into a faint enigmatic smile. "Madame, it is no game. It is a necessity. A killer sits among us, and they believe they have outwitted us all, but they have made mistakes, small but significant, and now we shall test their nerve." She paused, her gaze sweeping the table, lingering on each face as if reading the secrets etched within. "Let us begin with a simple question. Why was Sir Reginald's manuscript so important? Madame Whitmore, you have told us it contained a secret about Edmund's father, a secret so grave that you begged Sir Reginald to destroy it. But what, I wonder,
was the nature of this secret? Mrs. Whitmore, her face pale and drawn, shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the—
From what, Aunt Clara? What did my father do that was so terrible, and why would it matter now, after all these years? Miss Marple raised a hand, a gesture gentle but commanding silence.
Monsieur Edmund, your impatience is understandable, but it is not yet time for answers. It is time for questions. And I have another. The brandy glass found in the library contained traces of cyanide. Yet Sir Reginald was found in his study with no glass nearby. Someone moved that glass, no? Someone wished to create confusion to obscure the truth. Who among you was in the library that night after Mrs. Whitmore's conversation with Sir Reginald? The room grew still. The only sound, the faint patter of rain beginning to fall outside. Dr. Hargrove cleared his throat, his voice measured but strained. Monsieur Poirot, you are suggesting one of us deliberately tampered with evidence, but the library is a common room. Anyone could have been there. I myself passed through earlier that evening to retrieve a book. Oui, doctor, Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. And you have been most forthcoming about your movements. Yet I find it curious that you, a physician, did not notice the smell of cyanide in the library. It is a distinctive odor, is it not? Bitter almonds, unmistakable to a man of your expertise. Dr. Hargrove's face tightened, and he adjusted his glasses, a nervous gesture that did not go unnoticed. I was not there long, he said, and the windows were open. The smell might have dissipated. Miss Marple nodded as if considering this, but her expression suggested she was far from convinced. She turned her attention to Mr. Grayson, the butler, who stood near the sideboard, his posture as rigid as ever. Monsieur Grayson, she said, you have served this family for many years. You know their habits, their routines. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about Sir Reginald's behavior in the days before his death? Perhaps a visitor, a letter, a conversation that seemed out of the ordinary? Grayson hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Lady Beatrice before returning to Miss Marple. Sir Reginald was preoccupied, sir, he said, his voice low. He spent much time in his study working on his manuscript. But there was one thing. A letter arrived 2 days before his death, marked private. He read it and seemed agitated afterward. He locked it in his desk drawer. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. A letter, you say? And where is this letter now? Grayson shook his head. I don't know, sir. I never saw it again. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing the folded knitting in her lap. A letter? A manuscript? A stopped watch? A moved glass? These are not coincidences, mes amis. They are the work—
Room with an authority that belied her unassuming appearance. I propose a simple test. Inspector Japp, if you would be so kind as to fetch the manuscript from Sir Reginald's study. We shall examine it together, page by page, and see what it reveals. And I ask each of you to consider, what are you hiding? For the truth, it will not remain hidden for long. As Japp left to retrieve the manuscript, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Edmund's hands clenched into fists, his eyes darting between his aunt and his mother. Mrs. Whitmore's lips moved silently, as if in prayer. Dr. Hargrove's face was a mask of calm, but his fingers tapped nervously on the table. Lady Beatrice remained still, a gaze fixed on Miss Marple, a flicker of something, fear, defiance in her eyes. Grayson, ever the loyal servant, stood motionless, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the sideboard. Hastings watched, his heart pounding, as Miss Marple sat down again, a calm exterior, a stark contrast to the storm she had unleashed. She had set her trap, and now, he knew, it was only a matter of time before someone stumbled into it. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The rain had intensified outside Greystone Manor, its steady drumming against the windows a somber backdrop to the gathering in the dining room. The candelabras flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets of the house. Miss Jane Marple sat at the head of the mahogany table, her hands folded neatly over her knitting, her eyes gleaming with a quiet certainty that sent a shiver through Captain Hastings, who stood near the door, his gaze fixed on her. Inspector Japp had returned with Sir Reginald's manuscript, a thick sheaf of papers bound in leather, which he placed carefully on the table before Miss Marple. The suspects, Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, Edmund, Dr. Hargrove, and Mr. Grayson, sat or stood in a tense tableau, their faces a mixture of apprehension and defiance. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was calm, but carried the weight of finality. "Mes amis," she began, a tone measured, "we have reached the moment where the threads of this mystery must be woven into their final pattern. The watch, the manuscript, the brandy glass, the shawl, the letter, these are not mere objects, but the clues to a crime most cunning. And now, with the manuscript before us, we shall uncover the truth." She opened the leather cover, her fingers moving with deliberate precision as she turned the pages. The room was silent, save for the rain and the occasional creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. This manuscript, Miss Marple continued, was Sir Reginald's obsession. It chronicled the history of the Whitmore family, but it contained a secret so explosive that it drove someone to murder.
Reginald writes of a scandal involving his brother, Edmund's father, Charles Whitmore. A scandal that, if revealed, would have stripped the family of its title and much of its wealth. Charles, it seems, was not the legitimate heir to the Whitmore estate. His birth was irregular, shall we say, the result of an affair that was carefully concealed. Edmund's face went white, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's a lie!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "My father was a Whitmore through and through! This is nonsense!" Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture silencing him. "Monsieur Edmund, the truth is often painful, but it is the truth nonetheless. Sir Reginald discovered this secret through old letters and parish records. He intended to publish it, to set the record straight, even at the cost of his family's legacy. And someone in this room could not allow that to happen." Mrs. Whitmore's sobs broke the silence, her head bowed as she clutched a handkerchief. "I told him to destroy it," she whispered. "I begged him, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was his duty." "Oui, madame," Miss Marple said, her voice softening with a trace of sympathy. "But let us consider the events of that night. Sir Reginald was in the library, discussing this secret with you, Madame Whitmore. You left your shawl behind in your distress, but someone else was there, someone who overheard your conversation, or perhaps came later, someone who poisoned Sir Reginald's brandy and struck him from behind, ensuring his silence." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the room, sharp and cold. "Monsieur Poirot, this is speculation. You have no proof of who was in the library or who poisoned the brandy." Miss Marple's eyes met hers, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "Madame Beatrice, you are correct that proof is essential, and I have it. The brandy glass found in the library bore fingerprints, not Sir Reginald's, but those of someone else in this room. Inspector Japp, would you share the results of the analysis?" Japp stepped forward, his expression grim. "The fingerprints on the glass belong to Dr. Hargrove," he said, his voice steady. "We checked them against the household's records this afternoon." Dr. Hargrove's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "I handled the glass earlier that day when I visited Sir Reginald to check on his health. It means nothing." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. "No, Doctor, it means everything. You see, the glass was wiped clean after Sir Reginald's death, except for one set of prints. Yours. You were careful, but not careful enough. And there is more. The letter that Mr. Grayson mentioned, the one that agitated Sir Reginald, it was from a solicitor, confirming the illegitimacy of—
You were Sir Reginald's confidant. He trusted you with his discovery, and you betrayed that trust. Dr. Hargrove's composure cracked, his hands slamming onto the table.
"This is preposterous! I had no motive to kill him!"
"Had you not?" Miss Marple said, her voice calm but piercing. "You have been the family physician for many years, Doctor. You knew of the scandal, and you knew that its revelation would ruin not only the Whitmore family, but your own reputation. For you were complicit, were you not? You falsified records to protect Charles Whitmore's claim to the estate, ensuring your own position and wealth. Sir Reginald's manuscript threatened to expose you, and so you acted." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like a fog. Dr. Hargrove's face twisted, his eyes darting around the table as if seeking an escape.
"You have no proof,"
he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "The proof, Doctor, is in the manuscript itself. A page was torn out, the page that detailed your involvement. But Sir Reginald was meticulous. He kept a copy hidden in a locked drawer. Inspector Japp found it this afternoon, along with the solicitor's letter. And there is the matter of the cyanide. As a physician, you had access to it, and you knew its effects. You poisoned the brandy, struck Sir Reginald to ensure his silence, and then moved the glass to the library to confuse the timeline. The watch, stopped at 10:17, was your flourish, a theatrical touch to mark the moment of your triumph." Dr. Hargrove's shoulders slumped, his face crumpling as the fight left him. I didn't mean for it to come to this," he whispered. "He was going to ruin everything. My life's work, my reputation, it would all be gone." Japp stepped forward, his handcuffs at the ready. "Dr. Hargrove, you're under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Whitmore." As Japp led the doctor away, the room erupted into murmurs. Mrs. Whitmore's sobs grew louder. Edmund stared in stunned silence, and Lady Beatrice's face remained a mask of icy composure, though her hands trembled. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. Hastings approached her, his voice low. "Poirot, how did you know it was Hargrove? The fingerprints, the manuscript, it all came together so perfectly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Mon cher Hastings, it is the little grey cells. They see what others overlook, the contradictions, the patterns, the human heart. And in this case, the heart of a man who could not bear to lose everything he—"
Inspector Japp felt vast and silent, the candelabras burning low, their flickering light casting a warm but somber glow over the polished mahogany table. The manuscript, its secrets laid bare, lay closed before Miss Marple, a mute testament to the tragedy it had precipitated. She sat quietly, her knitting untouched, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant yet serene, as if she were contemplating not just the crime, but the very nature of human frailty. Hastings, seated across from her, leaned forward, his voice low and tinged with awe. "Poirot, I must say, you've done it again. The way you pieced it all together, the watch, the glass, the manuscript, it was nothing short of genius. But how did you know Hargrove was the key? I thought Mrs. Whitmore's confession would lead us elsewhere." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. "Mon cher Hastings," she said, her voice soft but carrying that familiar note of quiet authority. "The little grey cells, they do not rest. They observe, they connect, they question. Dr. Hargrove was a man of precision, like myself, but his precision was his undoing. He could not resist the theatrical flourish of stopping the watch, nor could he erase all traces of his presence from the brandy glass. But more than that, it was his heart that betrayed him, the fear of losing all he had built, the shame of a secret he had helped conceal for so long." Japp, standing near the fireplace, shook his head, a grudging admiration in his eyes. "I'll be damned, Poirot. You had me fooled with Mrs. Whitmore, her breakdown in the library. I was sure she was our culprit, but you saw through it all. That manuscript, though, nasty business, that family secret. Poor Edmund, learning his father wasn't who he thought." Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she looked toward the window, where the drizzle blurred the view of the gardens beyond. Oui, Inspector, it is a tragedy, not just for Sir Reginald, but for this family. The truth, it is a double-edged sword. It brings justice, but it also brings pain. Edmund will carry this wound, as will Madame Whitmore, who sought only to protect him. And Madame Beatrice, she too must face the wreckage of her family's legacy. Hastings frowned, his mind still grappling with the intricacies of the case. But Poirot, what about the letter Grayson mentioned, the one that agitated Sir Reginald? Was it really from a solicitor, or was that part of Hargrove's scheme? Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the cover of the manuscript. The letter was real, Hastings. Sir Reginald received it 2 days before his death, confirming the illegitimacy of his brother, Charles. It was the final piece of evidence he needed for his manuscript, the spark that set this tragedy in motion. Dr. Hargrove, as Sir Reginald's confidant, knew of the letter's contents. He saw his carefully constructed world crumbling. His complicity in falsifying records
Would be exposed, his reputation ruined. So he acted, with the precision of a man who has spent years hiding the truth. Japp let out a low whistle, rubbing the back of his neck. And to think, all this over a family secret. Makes you wonder how many more are buried in places like this. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained solemn. The human heart, Inspector, is a repository of secrets. Some are small, harmless. Others, like this one, are heavy enough to crush those who carry them. It is why I say always that to understand a crime, one must understand the heart. The little grey cells, they see the facts, but it is the heart that reveals the motive. Hastings leaned back, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. The stopped watch, the scattered manuscript, the brandy glass, Mrs. Whitmore's shawl, and now the letter that had sealed Sir Reginald's fate. "It's a grim business, Poirot," he said. "I suppose that's the cost of truth, isn't it? It doesn't always bring peace." "Non, mon ami," Miss Marple said, her voice softening further. "The truth does not always bring peace, but it brings clarity, and in clarity there is a kind of justice. For Sir Reginald, for this family, and even for Dr. Hargrove, who must now face the consequences of his actions." She rose from her chair, her small frame seeming to carry the weight of the case with ease. "Come, Hastings, Inspector. The rain has slowed, and the train to London awaits. Our work here is done." As they gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Hastings glanced back at the dining room, where the manuscript still lay on the table, a silent witness to the unraveling of a family. He thought of Lady Beatrice, who would now face the world alone, of Edmund, grappling with the truth about his father, and of Mrs. Whitmore, whose loyalty had led her to the edge of despair. And he thought of Miss Marple, whose unassuming presence had cut through the lies like a knife through silk. As they stepped out into the damp night, the manor looming behind them, Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the darkened windows. "The heart, Hastings," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It is a fragile thing, but it is also resilient. They will heal in time, and we move on to the next puzzle, no?" Hastings nodded, a smile tugging at his lips, despite the weight of the evening. "To the next puzzle, Poirot." And with that, they walked into the night, the drizzle washing away the last echoes of the tragedy at Greystone Manor. Chapter 12. Shadows of the Past. The drizzle had given way to a fine mist as dawn broke over Greystone Manor, cloaking the estate in a ghostly veil that softened its sharp edges. Inside, the grand drawing room felt quieter than it had in days. The familiar rhythm, a counterpoint to the stillness of the morning. Captain Hastings stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the gardens, where the mist curled around ancient yews, his mind still turning over the dramatic events of the previous evening. Inspector Japp had departed for the police station to finalize the paperwork on Dr. Hargrove's arrest, leaving Miss Marple and Hastings to tie up the loose ends of the case. The household was subdued, its members scattered to their private quarters, grappling with the fallout of Dr. Hargrove's confession. Lady Beatrice had retreated to her room, her composure unbroken, but her silence heavy with unspoken grief.
Mrs. Clara Whitmore, still shaken by her own partial confession, had taken to pacing the upstairs corridors, while Edmund, the young heir, had vanished into the grounds, seeking solace in solitude. Mr. Grayson, ever the dutiful butler, moved silently through the house, his face a mask of quiet resignation. Miss Marble's voice broke the silence, soft but clear, as she addressed Hastings. "Mon cher Hastings, you seem troubled. The case is solved, the murderer apprehended. Yet I sense your mind is not at ease." Hastings turned from the window, his brow furrowed. "You're right, Poirot. It feels unfinished somehow. Dr. Hargrove's motive was clear enough, protecting his reputation, covering up his part in the family secret. But what about the others? Mrs. Whitmore's distress, Lady Beatrice's silence, even Edmund's anger. There's more to this, isn't there? Something we haven't fully uncovered." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of insight. "You are perceptive, mon ami. The crime, it is solved, but the heart of this family remains wounded. There are shadows of the past that linger, shadows that Dr. Hargrove's actions brought to light, but did not dispel. Let us consider for a moment the manuscript once more." She gestured to the leather-bound sheaf of papers, which had been returned to the drawing-room table after Japp's examination. "Sir Reginald's work was not merely a history," she continued. "It was a reckoning. He sought to expose a truth that had been buried for decades, a truth about Charles Whitmore's illegitimacy. But there is another question we have not asked. Who else knew of this secret before Sir Reginald's discovery?" Hastings frowned, stepping closer. "You mean someone else in the family might have known about Charles's birth? But Mrs. Whitmore only admitted to learning it from Sir Reginald that night." "Oui, so she says," Miss Marple replied, her voice tinged with a gentle skepticism. "But secrets, they have a way of seeping through the cracks, no? Especially in a family as close-knit as this one. I have observed Madame Beatrice closely, and her composure, it is not the calm of innocence. Burden." Hastings's eyes widened. "You think Lady Beatrice knew? But she never said a word, not even when Mrs. Whitmore broke down." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Exactement. Her silence is telling, Hastings. A woman like Lady Beatrice, married to Sir Reginald, living in the shadow of the Whitmore legacy, she would have known of her husband's obsession with the family history, and perhaps, long ago, she learned the truth about her brother-in-law, Charles. It would explain her restraint, her refusal to engage with the manuscript's contents. She wished to protect the family's honor, even at the cost of her own peace." The door creaked open, and Mr. Grayson entered, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. His movements were as precise as ever, but there was a weariness in his posture, a subtle droop to his shoulders that had not been there before. He set the tray down and began to pour, but Miss Marple's gaze stopped him. "Monsieur Grayson," she said, her tone gentle but probing, "you have been most discreet throughout this affair, but I wonder if you too carry a piece of this puzzle. You mentioned the letter that agitated Sir Reginald. Did you perhaps know more about its contents than you have shared?" Grayson's hand faltered, the teapot trembling slightly before he set it down. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low, "I am a servant, nothing more. My duty is to the family, not to their secrets." Miss Marple's smile was kind but unyielding. "And yet, monsieur, a servant sees much, hears much. You have served the Whitmores for many years. Did you never overhear a conversation, see a letter, sense a tension that hinted at this family's hidden truth?" Grayson hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the manuscript on the table. I may have heard things, sir," he admitted at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, when Master Charles was still alive, there were whispers between him and Lady Beatrice. Late-night talks in the library, when they thought no one was listening. I never knew the details, but I knew it was something they wished to keep from Sir Reginald." Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed a suspicion. "Merci, Monsieur Grayson. Your loyalty is admirable, but your honesty is invaluable. You have given us another piece of the puzzle." As Grayson retreated, Hastings leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Poirot, are you saying Lady Beatrice and Charles conspired to keep this secret? That she's been hiding it all these years?" "Not a conspiracy, Hastings," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. "A pact, perhaps, born of love or duty. Lady Beatrice wished to protect her family, just as Mrs. Whitmore."
Hastings felt a pang of sympathy for the inhabitants of Greystone Manor, each caught in the web of their own history. "So what now, Poirot?" he asked. "The murder is solved. Hargrove is in custody. Do we tell them the rest? About Lady Beatrice's knowledge?" Miss Marple shook her head, her expression softening. "No, mon ami. Some truths are better left to heal in their own time. The family has suffered enough. Let them find their way forward without the added burden of our discoveries. Our task was to find a murderer, and that we have done." She rose, gathering her knitting with a grace that belied the weight of the case. "Come, Hastings. The mist is lifting, and the world awaits. Let us leave Greystone Manor to its shadows." As they stepped out into the cool morning air, Hastings glanced back at the manor, its stone facade softened by the mist. He thought of the secrets it still held, the unspoken truths that would linger long after they were gone. And he thought of Miss Marple, whose quiet brilliance had illuminated the darkest corners of this tragedy, leaving behind a clarity that, if not peace, was a kind of justice. Chapter 13. Echoes of Loyalty. The mist had lifted by mid-morning, revealing Greystone Manor in all its austere grandeur, its stone walls glistening faintly under the weak sunlight that broke through the clouds. Inside, the library, where so much of the tragedy had unfolded, felt like a shrine to the past, its shelves heavy with books that held the weight of history, both written and unwritten. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her knitting needles moving steadily, their soft clicks a quiet rhythm against the stillness of the room. Captain Hastings paced slowly along the bookshelves, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind restless despite the resolution of the case. The arrest of Dr. Hargrove had brought justice, but the manor still seemed to hum with unspoken tensions, as if the walls themselves held secrets yet to be revealed. Miss Marple's eyes followed Hastings, her expression one of gentle amusement, tempered by a deep understanding. "Mon cher Hastings," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you are like a hound who senses the trail is not yet cold. The murderer is in custody, yet you feel there is more to uncover, no?" Hastings stopped pacing, turning to face her. "You're right, Poirot. It's not that I doubt your solution. Hargrove's guilt was clear as day. But there's something about this fact beyond the point of impact. Dr. Hargrove's act was the stone, but the ripples, these are the loyalties, the silences, the burdens carried by those who remain. Let us consider for a moment the role of loyalty in this affair." Hastings raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Loyalty? You mean Grayson? He's been loyal to the family for years, but he did tell us about those late-night talks between Lady Beatrice and Charles." "Oui, exactement," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of insight. "Monsieur Grayson is a man of duty, but duty can be a complex thing. He serves the Whitmores, yet he knows their secrets, or at least he senses them. His hesitation, his glances toward Madame Beatrice, they speak of a loyalty divided. He has protected this family, but at what cost? I wonder if there is more he could tell us, if only we asked the right question. As if summoned by her words, the door to the library creaked open, and Mr. Grayson entered, carrying a silver tray with a single teapot and 2 cups. His movements were as precise as ever, but there was a subtle strain in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that suggested he had not slept. He set the tray on a side table and began to pour, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "Monsieur Grayson," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "you have been a pillar of this household through a most trying time. But I sense that you carry a weight, a knowledge that you have not yet shared. Tell me, what did you truly overhear in those late-night talks between Lady Beatrice and Master Charles all those years ago?" Grayson froze, the teapot hovering over the cup, a faint tremor in his hand. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low and strained, "I've told you what I know. I overheard nothing specific, only that they spoke in hushed tones, as if guarding a secret." Miss Marple's smile was kind but unrelenting. "And yet, monsieur, your loyalty to this family is such that you would protect them, even from the truth. I do not ask you to betray them, but to help them heal. The secret of Charles Whitmore's birth, it was known to Lady Beatrice, was it not? And perhaps to you in part?" Grayson set the teapot down, his hands clasping together, as if to steady himself. I never knew the full truth, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I suspected. Master Charles was a troubled man, always carrying a shadow. Lady Beatrice, she was his confidant, his protector. She spoke to him of duty, of keeping the family's honor intact. I heard her once say, 'No one must know, Charles. It would destroy us all.' I thought it was about his debts, his reckless ways. But now I see it was more." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "Merci, monsieur." For it drove Sir Reginald to his research, and Dr. Hargrove to his desperate act. Hastings stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Poirot, are you saying Lady Beatrice's silence caused all this? That she could have prevented Sir Reginald's death by speaking out?" "No, Hastings," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "We cannot blame Madame Beatrice for the actions of another. She chose silence to protect her family, just as Mrs. Whitmore chose to beg Sir Reginald to destroy his manuscript. Each acted out of loyalty, but loyalty, like love, can blind us to the consequences of our choices. Dr. Hargrove's crime was his own, driven by fear and ambition. But the echoes of loyalty, they resonate through this house, binding its inhabitants in a web of silence and sacrifice." The library door opened again, and Lady Beatrice entered, her black morning dress stark against the pale light streaming through the window. Her face was composed, but her eyes held a flicker of resignation, as if she knew the conversation had turned to her. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I heard you were still here. Have you come to unearth more of our shame?" Miss Marple rose, a small frame radiating a quiet dignity. "Madam," she said, "I seek not to shame, but to understand. Your silence, it was a shield for your family, but it could not protect them from the truth. I ask you now, not for myself, but for those who remain, Edmund, Madame Whitmore, will you let them carry this burden alone?" Lady Beatrice's lips trembled, and for a moment her composure wavered. "I knew," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "I knew about Charles, about his birth. I swore to my mother-in-law that I would keep it secret, to protect the family's name. But Reginald, he would not let it rest. He saw it as his duty to expose the truth. I couldn't stop him, but I couldn't betray him either." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes filled with compassion. "Your loyalty, madam, is a testament to your strength. But now, it is time to let the truth breathe. For Edmund's sake, for your own." Lady Beatrice's shoulders sagged, and she nodded, a single tear tracing down her cheek. "You're right, Monsieur Poirot. It's time." As she turned to leave,
Grayson stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm.
My lady, if I may, I will help you tell Master Edmund. He deserves to hear it from you.
Miss Marple watched them go, her expression one of quiet satisfaction.
The echoes of loyalty, she said softly, almost to herself. They bind us, but they can also set us free.
Hastings looked at her, a mixture of admiration, the next puzzle that awaits.
Chapter 14. The Weight of Truth. The midday sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale, golden light over Greystone Manor, as if offering a tentative promise of renewal after the storm of revelations. The library, where Miss Jane Marple and Captain Hastings had spent much of their time unraveling the mystery, was now bathed in a soft glow, the heavy bookshelves seeming less oppressive under the gentle illumination. Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the emotional currents still swirling through the house. Hastings stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the gardens where Edmund Whitmore could be seen walking slowly, his head bowed, as if grappling with the truths he had just learned. The atmosphere in the manor had shifted since Lady Beatrice's admission in the library. Her quiet confession to Miss Marple and Grayson, though not a direct link to the murder, had lifted a veil, exposing the deep loyalties and sacrifices that had shaped the Whitmore family's history. Mrs. Clara Whitmore had retired to her room, exhausted by her own emotional outpouring, while Lady Beatrice and Grayson had taken it upon themselves to speak with Edmund, to share the full weight of the family secret. The house felt quieter now, but it was a silence born of reflection, not resolution. Miss Marple's voice broke the stillness, her tone soft but carrying the weight of her insight. "Mon cher Hastings," she said, her eyes following his gaze to the solitary figure in the garden. "You watch young Monsieur Edmund with such concern. You fear for him, no? For what this truth will mean for his future." Hastings turned, his expression troubled. "I do, Poirot. To learn that your father wasn't who you thought, that your family's legacy is built on a lie. It's a heavy burden for a young man. And Lady Beatrice, carrying that secret all these years, it must have been unbearable. I can't help but wonder if there's more we could have done to ease their pain." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked at him with a gentle, almost maternal smile. "You have a kind heart, Hastings, and it does you credit. But we cannot carry the burdens of others, only help them to see the path forward. The truth, it is a heavy thing, but it is also a liberator. For Edmund, for Madame Beatrice, and even for Madame Whitmore, the truth is a chance to rebuild, to forge a new legacy untainted by deception." Hastings nodded, though his brow remained furrowed. "I suppose you're right, Poirot, but it's hard to see them suffer, especially when it was Hargrove's actions that brought all this to light."
Reginald's determination to reveal the truth about his brother's birth was a force that could not be contained. Dr. Hargrove's crime was a desperate attempt to stop that force, but in doing so, he only hastened its release. The little grey cells, they see the patterns, but it is the heart that drives such actions. Fear, pride, loyalty, these are the currents that shape our fates. The door to the library opened, and Lady Beatrice entered, her black morning dress replaced by a simple grey gown, as if she were shedding the weight of her grief. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes carrying a new clarity, as if her confession had lifted a long-held burden. She paused, her gaze settling on Miss Marple with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I wanted to thank you before you leave. Your persistence has brought us truth, though it was a truth I feared. Edmund knows now about his father, about the family. It was difficult, but Grayson was right. He deserved to hear it from me." Miss Marple rose, her small frame radiating a quiet dignity. "Madame Beatrice," she said,
Your courage in facing the truth is a testament to your strength. You have given your son a gift, though it may not feel so now. The truth. It allows us to move forward, to build anew. Lady Beatrice's lips trembled, but she nodded. I hope you're right, Monsieur Poirot. Edmund is angry, hurt, but he is young. He has time to make his own path. And I will try to guide him as best I can. Miss Marple's smile was warm, her eyes filled with compassion. You will, madame, and you will not be alone. The loyalty of this family, it is a strength, even in its pain. Monsieur Grayson, he will stand by you, as will Madame Whitmore, in her way. Lady Beatrice inclined her head, a silent acknowledgement, before turning to leave. As the door closed behind her, Hastings let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. You've done it again, Poirot, he said, a note of admiration in his voice. Not just solved the crime, but given them a way forward. I don't know how you do it. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a quiet promise of order in a world of chaos. It is not I, Hastings, she said, her voice soft but firm. It is the truth that does the work. We merely uncover it, like archaeologists brushing away the dust from a buried treasure. And now, mon ami, it is time for us to leave this place, to let the Whitmores find their way. Hastings nodded, gathering his coat from the back of the chair. To London, then? Or do you have another case waiting? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. The world, it is full of puzzles, Hastings, but for now, a cup of tea and a quiet train ride will suffice. The little grey cells, they deserve...
Way to the soft sounds of life resuming. Footsteps in the corridors, the clink of china in the dining room. Greystone Manor, for all its shadows, was beginning to heal, and Miss Marple, with her unerring insight, had been the catalyst for that change. Chapter 15. A Quiet Departure. The afternoon sun hung low over Greystone Manor, its golden rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the estate's drive, casting dappled patterns on the gravel path. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading roses, a reminder of the fleeting summer. Inside the manor, the heavy silence of the past days had begun to lift, replaced by the soft murmurs of a household tentatively finding its way forward. Miss Jane Marple stood in the grand hall, her small suitcase neatly packed, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Captain Hastings stood beside her, his coat draped over one arm, his hat in hand, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering melancholy. The case was closed, Dr. Hargrove's confession secured, and the truth about the Whitmore family's secret laid bare. Yet, as Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with her characteristic precision, her eyes swept the hall one last time, as if committing its details to memory. The polished oak staircase, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the faint echo of footsteps from the upper floors. The manor, for all its grandeur, seemed to exhale a sigh of release, as if grateful for the clarity she had brought. "Poirot," Hastings said, breaking the silence, "I must say, this has been one of your most remarkable cases, not just for the murder, but for what you've done for this family. You've given them a chance to start anew, despite the pain." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, her eyes twinkling with a quiet wisdom. "Mon cher Hastings, you flatter me, but it is not I who have given them this chance. It is the truth. The little grey cells, they uncover the facts, but it is the heart that decides what to do with them. The Whitmores, they will find their way, as families do, through pain and time." The door to the hall opened, and Lady Beatrice appeared, her grey gown a stark contrast to the black mourning attire she had worn earlier. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes carrying a new strength born of her recent confession. Behind her stood Mr. Grayson,
his posture as impeccable as ever, though his expression held a trace of relief, as if a long-held burden had been eased. Mrs. Clara Whitmore lingered at the foot of the stairs, her hands clasped nervously, while Edmund stood at one of quiet respect.
Madam Beatrice, your strength is a beacon for this family. You have faced the truth with courage, and that is no small thing. Monsieur Edmund, you have a future to shape, and I have no doubt you will do so with honor. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his voice low. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I don't know what to make of it all yet, but I'll try. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. I was wrong to hide from the truth, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I thought I was protecting Edmund, but I only added to the pain. You've shown us that, Monsieur Poirot. I won't forget it. Miss Marple's smile was kind, her gaze encompassing them all. Madam Whitmore, your love for your family is a strength, not a weakness. Let it guide you now as you rebuild. And, Monsieur Grayson, she added, turning to the butler, your loyalty has been the backbone of this house. Continue to serve with your heart, and you will not falter. Grayson bowed slightly, a rare warmth in his eyes. Thank you, sir. I shall do my best. As the group exchanged final farewells, Hastings felt a pang of bittersweet satisfaction. The manor, once a place of secrets and shadows, was beginning to breathe again, its inhabitants stepping cautiously into a new chapter. He glanced at Miss Marple, marveling at how her unassuming presence had unraveled such a complex web of deceit and loyalty, leaving behind a path to healing. The carriage arrived to take them to the station, its wheels crunching on the gravel drive. Miss Marple stepped outside, pausing to take one last look at Greystone Manor. The sun caught the stone facade, illuminating its weathered beauty, and for a moment it seemed to stand taller, as if freed from the weight of its past. Another puzzle solved, Poirot, Hastings said as they settled into the carriage, the manor receding into the distance. But I wonder, do you ever tire of it? The secrets, the lies, the pain they cause. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was thoughtful. Tire, Hastings? No, I do not tire. The world, it is full of puzzles, and each one teaches us something about the human heart. The pain, it is part of the truth, but so is the hope that follows. We uncover the one to make way for the other. The carriage rolled on, the countryside unfolding before them, a patchwork of fields and hedgerows bathed in the soft light of late summer. Hastings leaned back, a smile tugging at his lips. To the next puzzle, then. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a quiet promise of order in a chaotic world. Oui, mon ami. To the next puzzle. And with that,